after me. I'm a man. I'm 40.
Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm Nick DiMartino. That's Ben Kruse. This is another episode of episode 44 of Moving the Goalpost. You can follow me on Twitter at Nick DiMart. You can follow Ben at Ben Kruse144. You can follow this show at MTGP ETB on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can follow the Empty the Bench Network at ETB Network on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can find all Empty the Bench shows. You can watch all Empty the Bench shows on youtube.com/ETB Network. You can listen to this show and all Empty the Bench shows on etbpodcast.com. You can listen to Moving the Goalpost wherever you get your podcasts, and make sure to like and subscribe. And of course, Moving the Goalpost is on the Empty the Bench Network is presented by Playback. Watching sports is more fun with others, but we spend too much time watching alone. Playback is a virtual space where communities can stream live sports together with everyone perfectly synced up. Creators can hop on stage, deliver their own play-by-play analysis and commentary, and invite viewers up for Q&A. Playback makes watching sports fully interactive and a social experience. From playing fantasy sports, repping your favorite players and teams, and watching with the commentators and communities you care about. Win or lose, sports are best enjoyed together. Join our community by going to playback.tv/ETB Network to find out more, including our live stream schedule. All right, so the big news of the day, at least for me, it is the Jets. I guess we're in a 12-hour news cycle or something, but the Jets fired Joe Douglas. I wake up to find out the news that the Jets fired Joe Douglas. Before we even talk about Joe Douglas getting fired, we do kind of have to talk about this colossal of a game that we saw on Sunday. I'm sure you saw at least some of this game too. I guess this team never fails to amaze me. This team never really fails to amaze me because the Colts are like a top 10 worst team in the league. They are one of the worst teams in the league, and the Jets just lost to them at home. They are one of the worst teams against the spread, it is worth noting, if you care about that. One of the worst teams against the spread. This is a team that is favored so often and just keeps losing. Like this is one of the few teams I've ever seen that is losing all of these games, and in most of them, they're favored in these games. I mean, they weren't favored against Buffalo or against Minnesota, but they were favored against, New England, and they were favored against the Colts, and they were favored against the Cardinals, actually. This is just a disgrace. I don't know. How much of this did you really see this game?
I watched it in bits and pieces.
Okay. So,
but I heard what happened.
So so there's kind of a lot to get to with this game, but I think it all kind of comes down to the very end, I would say, is how I would put it. I mean, also the beginning too, I would say. In the first half, the offense was totally stagnant. The Colts had a 13-0 lead up until, I would say, the very end of the first half. And one of the times, it might not have been the first time they scored, but I think it may have been the second time that they scored. The Jets defense got a good sacked Anthony Richardson, and he fumbled, and the Jets Breece Hall scored a touchdown on short field. Actually, Breece Hall played a fairly good game, I would say. Garrett Wilson didn't do much of anything. Devontae Adams also played a good game. He had some big plays. But in fairness to Garrett Wilson, in some of the plays in some of the plays that Aaron Rodgers also gave him a lot of bad throws, at least like 2 or 3 times when Garrett Wilson could have made a play. Aaron Rodgers gave him a terrible throw, like threw the ball behind him. So it's kind of hard to blame him too much. Garrett Wilson is good, but he keeps like disappearing every other game, it seems like.
Mhm.
But in this case, a lot of them were just sort of like kind of Rodgers' fault. And you know what? There's a lot of blame to go around, I would say. I mean, Aaron Rodgers is a shell of himself. He's coming off an Achilles injury, so he's not and he's 40 years old. So obviously he's not the same quarterback, the same Hall of Fame quarterback that he once was. It's actually very reminiscent of Peyton Manning in 2015, the year that he won the Super Bowl, actually. Very reminiscent of Peyton Manning, when the year that he got people forget because he won the Super Bowl, but that was the year he got benched for Brock Osweiler. So this is very reminiscent of that when it comes to Aaron Rodgers. The difference is that Broncos team had a good defense and a good team around him, whereas Aaron Rodgers does not. That's the difference. And there's just look, they should have won that game. Another game that they should have won. And I feel like I keep saying the same thing over and over again. Not against the Cardinals or against the Niners or some of the games they got blown out in. But the problem is that we keep saying they should have won all of these games. But the problem is they're against bad teams. They're against teams that are even worse than the Jets. They're against bottom 10 teams. I mean, Anthony Richardson is a terrible quarterback. He's been awful. Anthony Richardson has a completion percentage under 50% for the season. But he threw for 272 yards and like 67% completion percentage against the Jets. The Jets have succeeded at making Anthony Richardson look good. That's how bad they've been.
Yeah, like you mentioned. Obviously, we'll talk about the Douglas Lane very shortly, but yeah, I mean, who would have thought when you brought in all this talent right at the start of the year? I think the expectations for you guys, and I think we talked about this, Nick. They're supposed to be definitely for sure a playoff team. We're obviously not talking Super Bowl, but definitely the ceiling is to be in the playoffs, right? With kind of everything that you had, the expectations.
I wouldn't say the ceiling. I would say the expectation.
Right. Yeah, the expectation of it. Yeah. And then of course, obviously kind of a slow start. You guys decided to fire Robert Saleh, and then you're like, all right, maybe kind of Ober can come in and kind of help, maybe kind of kickstart some stuff. Instead, it's gotten worse. Instead, for some odd reason, I mean, it looks like Aaron Rodgers has been very, I want to go with washed per se, but it just doesn't seem like he is, the Aaron Rodgers that I think Jet fans are hoping for. It's, he's showing flashes here and there, but he's getting up there in age. And I think that, it happens when you're getting up there as an aging type of quarterback. But I will say this, that I do think the biggest thing is the defense. I think the defense coming into the season, heck, I picked them up in our fantasy league for our podcast group, but I dumped them because of how underwhelming they've been the last couple of weeks. Like you mentioned, Anthony Richardson, this guy was just benched for the last 2 weeks under the Colts, and he comes in and he puts up an absolute dandy of a game, including the go-ahead game-winning drive right at the end, when the Jets, of course, were up by I think by 8 or 9 or whatever, at least to kind of
they were up by 5. You mean when Anthony Richardson had the game-winning drive to win the game?
Yeah, probably. But like
they were up 5.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the Jets were up 5.
Okay, they're up by 5, but I knew that like earlier in the fourth quarter they were up by a specific amount.
They were up by 8 earlier.
Yeah, but regardless of the fact, it was a close game, and yeah, just the Jets. I always feel about this too, Nick, is it's always coming down to the end of these games that the Jets are losing. It's not just like when it happens, it's like, all right, they're right there. And, of course, against my Patriots, they were within, I don't know, 25, 30 seconds. Ramondre had that touchdown, of course, the 2-point conversion. Jets had a chance to get the ball back, but they didn't have a ton of time to get the ball back and win. Obviously, the Cardinals game, they got their doors blown off. I mean, they weren't even competitive. This game against the Colts, I was expecting them to be competitive, and I was actually expecting the Jets to win, silly me. I picked them. I think it was a -4 was the spread for them, but Yeah, I just don't know whether it's a coaching thing, whether it's a Rodgers thing. It just seems like everything just kind of coming apart. Now, of course, with the Douglas news, of course, I think this is the end of his contract this year too. So it's basically like, all right, we're just going to clean house. I mean, who would have thought that right before Thanksgiving that the New York Jets, instead of competing to go to a playoff spot, would be competing to start selling pieces. So it just sucks because I'm a Patriot fan, but like it just sucks of like with the way that this Jets team was because I could you not I was kind of low key kind of seeing how they're going to be this year, and I thought that maybe things would be different. Instead, it's
Well,
not.
I mean, I'd say it's really just a little bit of everything is how I would put it. I mean, nothing is really clicking for the Jets right now. I mean, it's part
No,
of it is Rodgers is not good anymore. That's part of it. But it's not just that. I mean, if the team around him was actually good, it might not be that big of a problem. Maybe they'd at least be competitive. The defense is terrible. The offensive line is bad. The secondary is bad. Like every little and earlier in the season, the kicking was bad. Like not so
and
much
there's stuff
anymore, but
though like off the field too with Sauce Gardner. I mean, he's talking about how Ulbrich gave them a tackling lesson, and apparently he was saying like we don't need it. While he essentially said that he made some I mean, of course, the missed tackle he had on McBride
yeah,
in the Cardinals game was absolutely disgusting. And then of course he got absolutely burnt on I think it was the long game that Richardson had to Josh Downs this
yeah.
past Sunday. So
Well,
he was
there were quite a few.
looked at as one of
One
the
of
best
them,
corners in the league. And like you said
yeah.
early on when we talked about the Jets, you thought they was a little overrated. I mean, he is completely fallen off. And between him and guys like DJ Reed, a lot of your guys that you're expecting a ton from have just completely fallen off, at least so far this year.
Yeah, I mean, Sauce Gardner is the most obvious. Like how many, like every big play, he's getting beat, and he can't tackle because he weighs like 90 pounds. Like he can't tackle he can't tackle for his life. I mean, that Trey McBride missed tackle was terrible. Also, why was there no help around him? That's another thing that I'd like to know. And
Yeah,
I think part of the reason, as bad as he's been, I think part of the reason he's getting burned so bad is because the Jets' pass rush has been so bad. I think that's part of it
that's
too
shocking too.
because the pass rush very much affects the secondary and
Mhm.
corners don't cover for that long. So that's part of the reason I think that he's getting burned so badly. But yes, I do think he's extremely overrated. Every big play is just Sauce Gardner getting burned. Like every big play and it happened the final drive of that game. Now, I know we're going to have to talk about uh like, the play call at the end. But here's what I'll say. The Jets offense was stagnant for many periods of that game. Not in the third and fourth quarter exactly, but the first quarter, I'd say the first half, most of the first half of that game, they were completely stagnant. They couldn't move the ball at all. The receivers weren't getting separation. Aaron Rodgers was missing on easy throws. Maybe some of them not easy throws, but he was throwing it behind the receivers. Like Aaron Rodgers was not playing good enough. And so, you're not going to be able to win games that way in the NFL. You're not going to be able to win games that way. But the obvious thing at the end was kicking the field goal and that instead of going for it on 4th and 2 when the Jets were up 24-22 at the end of the game. Now, I will still, as much as I don't like the coaching with the Jets, I will defend that move. I'll defend that move because if you kick the field goal to go up 27-22 at the end of the game, and if you kick that field goal, you go up 5 points with like less than 3 minutes left. With less than 3 minutes left, and you're giving the ball back to Anthony Richardson. Like you're not giving the ball back to Patrick Mahomes with like a minute left. You're giving the ball back to Anthony Richardson. So to me, it is not too much to ask to say, okay, we're going to kick the field goal, go up 5, defense does something. And the difference is that people say like, you got to go for it. It's 4th and 2. From the way the Jets offense has been playing and has been looking, I'm not so sure about 4th and 2. I'm not so sure about a 2-yard game, right? Like I'm not so sure about a 2-yard game. Whereas you also have to remember in today's era of football where, all you got to do is get to like maybe the 40-yard line and you're borderline field goal range, basically.
Mhm.
And as opposed to, going down the whole length of the field, which is why I think it was a good move. Like, just on paper, I think it was a good move because now you can't judge whether or not a play call is good or bad based on whether or not it works, because any play call could work or not work. This time it didn't work, but who knows what would have happened if they had gone for it. Maybe they would have missed it, and then the Colts would have gone down the field and kicked the field goal, or whatever the case, or that they would have been up by a bigger margin. Who knows? Who knows what would have happened if they had not done that? So there's no guarantee you're going to get it either way. But I think that is a smart move. Like, that is, under the circumstances, that is the smartest move, to kick the field goal and make the Colts go down the full length of the field in order to take the lead, as opposed to just kicking a field goal to take the lead, which is almost, well, not double, but, close to that, as opposed, like, saying, like, I would agree. I would understand that argument if you were giving the ball back to, like, say, Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen or one of the great quarterbacks, but you're giving the ball back to Anthony Richardson. He's one of the worst quarterbacks in the league. And the Jets have successfully made Anthony Richardson look good. That's how bad they are. That's how bad the Jets are. They have successfully made Anthony Richardson look like a good, competent quarterback. Want to hear something? Listen to this. Think about this. Anthony Richardson for the season has completed less than 50% of his passes. His completion percentage is less than 50%. His completion percentage against the Jets was 67%. He goes from less than 1/2 to 2/3 completion percentage against the Jets. That's how bad the Jets defense is. That's how bad the Jets are. I mean, he threw for almost 300. He threw for like 272 yards against the Jets. That's how bad the Jets have been. No. So it's like the thing is that it's not too much to ask your defense to do something, right? Yeah. It's just not too much to ask for them to say, okay, this is one of the worst quarterbacks in the league. You can stop him from going the full length of the field, and they couldn't do it.
Yeah. I was going to quickly ask you this, Nick. So I was thinking about this once Douglas got fired, which we'll talk about momentarily. I know, of course, a lot of people are on Saleh for the fire and this and that. But, like, you're seeing this with Ulbrich. Of course, he was supposed to be a defensive guru. And I feel like the defense under him has just been atrocious. And I know that obviously Robert Saleh kind of lost the team, this and that, later on. But I don't know. Like, do you feel like as of right now, and of course, it's on the players at the end of the day. Don't get me wrong. So even if Saleh was still around, this stuff could still be happening. But do you feel like specifically, if you look at the two coaches right now, do you feel like the Jets defense would keep on regressing the way it has been if Saleh was still here? No. Or do you feel like with Ulbrich, it's just kind of the way that he is basically getting into these guys and something's just not working?
No, I think it very clearly is that Saleh is, that's absolutely the reason why. Look, Saleh I'm not a fan of Robert Saleh. He is not a good head coach. But that doesn't mean it's a good idea to fire him in the middle of the season.
Good. Yeah.
He's a good coordinator. He knows defense very well. It's similar to how I felt about Todd Bowles. I always thought Todd Bowles would be a good defensive coordinator. He's not the best head coach. He wasn't a very good head coach with the Jets. But if they had fired Todd Bowles in the middle of like the 2018 season or something like that, like, I don't think that would be a good idea. And Woody Johnson firing him, some people say that, I don't know if this is true or not, but some people say it's because they lost to the Vikings in London and he was embarrassed. I don't know if that's true or not. That's just speculation.
The Vikings were hot though at the time, so like I don't know how would that be.
That's the thing. The Vikings are a good team, and at the time they were the best team in the league, arguably. They were. I think they were actually undefeated at the time, so it's not that bad. They also lost to Sam Darnold, which may have made things a little worse. And none of us really know the full reason why Saleh was fired, even though there were rumors. A lot of people wanted him fired. But it turns out they were all wrong. They weren't exactly, let me rephrase that. They weren't wrong about Saleh, but they were wrong about how to go about it, is how I would put it. Because it's not like you can fire Saleh or any head coach in the middle of the season and go out there and get a real head coach. It doesn't work that way.
Yep.
Like who would you have brought in the middle of the season that could replace Saleh? And the answer was nobody. It was Jeff Ulbrich, the defensive coordinator. And that's the problem with franchises that are just so trigger happy to fire head coaches and fire GMs in the middle of the season, which is that, like, it's really a lot of it really just comes down to the ownership. That's what it is. I mean, here's how I would put it. The ownership, the ultimate cause of the Jets' problems, it's not even the Jets' problems, any business you want to talk about. Like if a business is just failing for 20 years or whatever, the ultimate cause is not, the employees. It's ultimately the owner. The owner is the ultimate cause because they oversee everything. And that's what it is. Like you can say the coaching, you can say Aaron Rodgers, you can say the Jets defense. All of those are just proximate causes. The ultimate cause is Woody Johnson. Ultimately, that's who the problem. And look, I'm fine with firing Joe Douglas. I don't think firing a GM in the middle of the season is the same as firing a head coach in the middle of the season. It's obviously not the same thing. But I'll say, and Joe Douglas is not a good GM. Mm-hmm. He probably should have been fired. He's terrible at drafting, and he's not a good head. He drafted Zach Wilson. he drafted Zach Wilson, so that's a pretty good reason to get fired. Although he's made a few good moves too. He's made also made a few good moves to give him credit.
Yeah, to be fair, he has tried to get your franchise back to some competence. Unfortunately, the competence has been overtaken by the lack of leadership by the coaching.
Yes. Yeah. And in fairness, all of the bad decisions were not made by Joe Douglas. In his defense, it was not Joe Douglas who fired Robert Saleh. That was Woody Johnson. So a lot of the blame, I think some of the blame goes to Joe Douglas, but not all of it. And not all of it. He's not the one. And by the way, you could have said the same thing about Saleh. It's not Saleh. Robert Saleh didn't draft Zach Wilson. It's not him who made the mistake. That was Joe Douglas who made that mistake. And but ultimately the problem is Woody Johnson because he's the owner. He's in charge of everything. He's the ultimate cause of all these problems. And the truth is, if the Jets hadn't fired Saleh, there's a good chance maybe they'd have a chance. Because it is very obvious that the Jets team, the team as a whole, especially the defense, has regressed after they fired Robert Saleh and went to Jeff Ulbrich as the head coach, who doesn't know what he's doing. Jeff Ulbrich doesn't know what he's doing. So it is so obvious to me that was the wrong move. It's obvious to everybody that firing Saleh in early October was a bad move. It's just so painfully obvious. Mm-hmm. It's just like, Joe Douglas is not a good GM. And what are they going to do? He's probably going to hire some other GM who's also not going to be good. And the cycle continues, I guess is how you could put it. I'd like to see him sell the team, but that's not going to happen.
I was just thinking too, because we were talking about Ulbrich I was thinking, because Saleh, like you mentioned, like we talked about, I don't think he's a great head coach, but theoretically he still could have been on the staff because there's really no outside potential head coach out there that could be coming in and making an impact. Where, you could keep Ulbrich at the head coach and he might not know what the hell he's doing, but you can keep Saleh still on the staff and have him to be a defensive coordinator where he is good, at least in that case, because he is.
Well, you can't do that though. Head coaches never. Are you suggesting maybe they could have kept him on the staff and not been the head coach?
Theoretically, but I guess that might not be the case.
Nobody does that.
Yeah.
And first of all, in jobs in general, people rarely get demoted. Usually you just get fired.
but if you look back on it, right, if there's any type of a situation that could be potentially make it fixable for the defense, that's what potentially I would have done. Is because at least because there's really no guy. It's basically Ulbrich's trying to make everything going with the defense, and he's as a defensive guy, he's not even doing that. So it's
well, that's the problem. I suppose what would have happened if they had done that theoretically, they would have run back to Robert Saleh, hired him, and remade him and made him the head coach again, and then Jeff Ulbrich goes back to being the defensive coordinator.
True, yeah.
I guess theoretically, I don't know if that's even a thing, really. I guess that's sort of what they did with Hackett, but there's a little bit of a difference between demoting a coordinator and demoting a head coach. I think those two things are a little different. is how I would put it. But yes, I mean, it was just in hindsight was just the stupidest thing they could have done because, there are some games that the Jets lost where, they could have won. And coaching was likely the reason. I mean, against the Patriots and against the Colts, not just coaching, but also how incompetent their defense looked, which would not have looked as bad as it was under Robert Saleh. I mean, I think there's a good chance the Jets could be 6-5 or 5-6, hovering around 500 if Robert Saleh was still the head coach. And in that scenario, the Jets have a shot at making the playoffs because the AFC is not great. I mean, sure, they still have to worry about Denver, who beat them head to head. And the Chargers and Steelers would be way ahead of them, but they'd have a shot at that last wild card spot, the Jets. And look, I'm not saying they definitely would have made the playoffs. The likelihood is probably under 50%. But here's the thing. Right now, the season is over, and there's nothing we could do about it. Whereas then at least we'd have a shot in that scenario with 5 or 6 wins. I mean, we'd be ahead of the Bengals, and the Bengals schedule coming up is much more difficult than the Jets schedule coming up. And the one other team you'd have to worry about is Denver, who beat the Jets head to head. But in that scenario, the Jets have a chance. Now the Jets don't have a chance, and we're losing to terrible teams. I don't even know. I think we're probably the 7th worst team in the league right now. 7th worst. We were supposed to be maybe the 7th best going into the season.
Yeah, I
but
guess
we're not. We're the 7th worst. This franchise is just a disgrace. And ultimately, it just comes down to the ownership. That's what it is. It is run by the same clowns that have run it my entire lifetime, basically. That's why this franchise is so bad.
Yeah, I mean, it's I really know in terms of what's next. I mean, because it's like we talked about, it could be the same exact cycle all over again as long as he's at the top. And I hate to cross, other things, but like if you're on a job and you have the same boss for forever, but you're essentially moving different other people around like musical chairs, it doesn't really mean a lot until essentially the head of that specifically is, not around anymore. And so I think with the Jets specifically, they could add who would have thought, Nick, that the Jets would essentially downgrade this year as a team when you look at what they've had the last couple of years at quarterback, Zach Wilson, in terms of the overall roster, you add Aaron Rodgers, you had Devontae Adams, obviously Alan Lazard going down, of course, wasn't big, but obviously was playing well to start the year. But you get all of these pieces and just the fact of like where they have been the last couple of years and the way that this team, and obviously whether it was coaching or just like execution, things could be different, but they're in the same exact spot. And it's absolutely, I mean, as a Patriot fan myself, I'm even mind-boggled like how in the hell this is going on. I really am.
Yeah. All right, so I want to move on. The Bills beat the Chiefs. The Chiefs finally get a loss. I think it was due to happen because they have to be. I don't know this for a fact, but for a 9-0 team, they had to have had they had a really bad. They might have had the worst point differential of any 9-0 team in history. Like that's with the Chiefs. I was in Vegas. I actually took. I live bet at halftime the Bills -2.5. At Bills second half. And actually, I guess that was that was one good bet that actually hit, unlike any of my unnecessary wagers.
Ooh.
I think, yeah. I mean, look, the Chiefs are still 9-1. They're still the favorites to come out of the AFC, but the Bills they're not far behind. The Bills, they're not too far behind, and they were supposed to be so much worse. That's the interesting thing about the Bills. They were supposed to be so much worse because they lost so many players, but they're actually better than they were last year, it seems like.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't get the chance to watch a ton of this game because I was in DC and I was with my buddy at a Pistons and Wizards game. Crazy. It wasn't much of a game, but
Pistons,
I wanted
Wizards.
Yeah. Trust me, I don't know why the hell I was there, but I was down in DC. They were playing, and I decided to watch some hoops. But I was obviously kind of tracking the game as I was at that game. Um, and yeah, I just thought that the Chiefs, credit to them. Obviously, that they're probably still the best team in the AFC, but they were in so many close games, and obviously a win's a win, right? But they weren't completely like dominating like these type of teams. Even like last week against the Broncos, who by the way obviously are playing a lot better football, so credit to them. But like, they had to have a game blocking field goal. I mean, obviously a lot of their games that they were having, credit to them, they were finding ways to win. But I just felt like eventually it was about to crack. I didn't know if it was going to be this past Sunday. I thought that maybe they would go into Buffalo and maybe Josh Allen has a turnover late or something and Patrick Mahomes signs away. But I think that now that the Chiefs had this, I think this might be for the better for them because they can kind of be like, all right, we can kind of see like how it could really turn up to the next level. Because beforehand, I mean, yeah, they were 9-0, but like obviously they had some really good games in there, like completely dominant type of games. But I didn't think that they were completely dominating their opponents. And it was more of a lot of the other teams' mistakes than they essentially kind of completely turn on in a lot of these games. I also think that Patrick Mahomes has been very vulnerable this year. I feel like he's just turned the ball over a lot more than he has been. And maybe it's just, the weapons, this and that. But I mean, the weapons that he has are still really good. But I just think that, and Mahomes is obviously playing fine, don't get me wrong. But like, I just felt that, they, if any type of game where they might lose this, it could be this one. And I do think the Bills play the Chiefs well in the regular season. It all comes down to the playoffs.
but not in the postseason.
Chiefs always have them
Yeah.
in the postseason. So if anything, this kind of figures that this potentially could happen. But I will say for the Bills, I mean, they've been playing good football as the last couple weeks here, and gotta give credit to McDermott and a lot of their guys that they had. So obviously, we'll see. Potentially, this might be an AFC Championship preview that might just happen. Two of the best quarterbacks in the game going at it. Not surprised the way this kind of game, figured out to be. But like, I think that the Chiefs need a little humbling pie kind of coming to them. And Patrick Mahomes was even saying it after the game. I was in his post game. He basically was saying that like, this was basically probably bound to happen at some point. And now we can kind of learn from our mistakes and kind of hopefully learn better from this. And so I think that it's kind of a good thing for both teams. I think for the Bills, I mean, they have to realize that they have to beat this team in the playoffs, but it's good to obviously break the unbeaten streak for them. But I also do think for the Chiefs, I know that for a lot of times when teams lose, it's not good, of course, but it might be a blessing for a disguise for a team like the Chiefs.
Well, I will say, in fairness to the Chiefs, most of the games that were close are against teams that at least have been playing pretty well. Is how I would put it. The close game against the Broncos. I mean, the Broncos are a pretty hot team right now. The close game against the Falcons and against the Bengals. I mean, those teams are actually fairly good. But I'll say, I do think that winning games that are close is a skill in and of itself. And, that's a fairly underrated skill. And they're 9-1. Like, that's 90%.
Right.
That's, you're not going to get much better than that. I think that the only team better than the Chiefs right now is the Lions. I think the Lions are better. Okay. They're the only team that is actually dominant, really dominant. And the Bills I don't think the Bills are far behind the Chiefs at all. I don't think they're far behind the Chiefs at all. I mean, their only two losses were against Houston and against Baltimore. So I think the Bills are, I think the Bills are capable of beating anybody. I think the Bills are, they're a top 5 team. I mean, it's funny because I think the AFC is weak for the most part, but it's mostly the haves and the have-nots. It's mostly like the Chiefs, the Bills, the Ravens, and everybody else. Whereas the NFC is a better conference, more competitive, but they don't have as many top teams as the AFC does, if that makes sense. I think the best team in the NFC right now is the Lions. And then there's a bunch of other good teams, but they're not even close to as good as the Lions. Is how I would put it.
Yeah, I think that the Lions are the best balanced team out of the whole entire NFC.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, there's other good teams in the NFC too. Obviously, you have the Eagles, you have the Commanders, the Rams, and
Packers.
Packers, Niners, but they're all kind of hovering around some tier that is below that's below the Lions, and some of them were previously very injury riddled, so they don't have the best records. But when you look at the best teams, many of them are actually in the AFC. I do want to talk about the Chargers and Bengals. So the Chargers almost blew a crazy lead against the Bengals. I don't know how much of this game you saw.
Yeah, I saw the ending.
You what?
I saw the ending of it.
Okay. So, I mean, the Chargers have gotten so much better since Harbaugh took over. Although, I mean, it is worth noting when we were talking about bad kicking for the Jets, Evan McPherson missing those 2 field goals kind of did kill the Bengals a little bit.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if this was true or not, but Jamar Chase was saying post game that I wouldn't say he was ripping on McPherson, but dude, he had 2 chances. I mean, to potentially win it. I mean, the Bengals had so many games this year, just like on Sunday, where they find ways to lose in just dumb fashion. It's been like that way for that franchise for so long. But I will say this. I mean, you can't afford to be down that early in the game and try to come back and win. I mean, just their defense just kind of came apart. And give credit to Joe Burrow. I mean, Joe Burrow, there was a stat line out there after the game that I was reading that just the amount of stats that he's done well with and these losses has been absolutely incredible. And the defense is just absolutely letting him down in all these games.
Yeah. Well, yeah, which is why I think I find it so silly when people obsess over just quarterback wins as a stat. Like winning the number of wins that a quarterback has as if it's an individual sport. It almost reminds me of like a pitcher. Here's what Joe Burrow reminds me of. And by the way, I think they're overly reliant on Joe Burrow. He threw the ball 50 times against the Chargers. 50 times.
That's crazy.
So I mean, so they're just overly reliant on him, and his passer rating was 98. So he didn't actually play a bad game at all. And
No, he didn't.
And he threw for how many teams could have their quarterback throw for 350 yards and still lose?
Not a lot.
He threw for 350 yards, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions, and they still lost. That's like the opposite of the Lions last week when they beat the Texans when Jared Goff threw 5 picks. They're like the opposite. They're basically the opposite. And yeah, that's why I think this year is proof that wins for quarterbacks doesn't tell the whole story when you look at the Bengals.
Yeah, I just thought, I was kind of looking at this game of the Chargers are going to charger, but the Bengals essentially Bengaled enough where the Chargers chargering, they were able to get the ending of it. Because a lot of the times when the Chargers are up in a lot of these games, they lose them. But they found a way because of the incompetence that the Bengals had at the end of this game, where their defense essentially lost them the game. And to give credit, I thought Justin Herbert was good. But in the second half, of course, the fumble that he had for the Bengals when they kind of kept on going for, the way the Bengals are coming back. I do think that the Chargers are a pretty good team this year. And I do think it's one, because Justin Herbert's playing really well, but 2, the Harbaugh effect, right? If it came down to the charging like they did on Sunday with like Brandon Staley, I guarantee you, I think that they lose that game. Zach Taylor, I think, has to go. I think that something's going on with him recently for that team. So, yeah.
Well, and here's the thing. The Bengals are not a bad team. I don't think they're a bad team, even though their record is not great. But it is worth noting their schedule is a gauntlet for the rest. They have some really tough games, which is why I was so pissed off about the Jets. Because if the Jets had been fairly competent in some of these easy games that they should have been able to win, they would have a real playoff shot because the Bengals are so behind the 8 ball. I mean, they have to play the Steelers in 2 weeks. Then Dallas, the Titans, and the Browns, which should be easy wins. The Broncos is kind of 50-50. And then the Steelers, which could very well be a loss. So we don't know if they have 5 wins of the remaining of the remaining 6 games. How many of those are they going to win?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe 8. Maybe they go 8-9, 9-8, and the Jets would have a real shot at being able to beat them out.
Yeah, no, the track record so far for the Bengals, I mean, and it sucks because Joe Burrow, I feel like, has played better in the games of teams over 500 than he has been under 500.
Yeah.
But the games that they've been winning have been in the games under 500 with very garbage teams or very mediocre teams that are like right around them. So it just sucks because, like you said, I don't think the Bengals are a bad team with all the offensive talent that they have around them, but the defense and the coaching is the reason why they're not as good as what they should be.
Right. And you were saying the Bengals are going to Bengal. You know what the Bengals did? They did a 2023 Chargers. That's what they did. The Bengals did what the Chargers would have done last year, which, by the way, goes to show you how much coaching matters, especially with young quarterbacks.
100%.
I mean, the Chargers have 7. They're 7-3. They have more wins this year so far than they did all of last year. Yep. All of last year, and like largely the same team, basically. Same quarterback and everything. So basically, Jim Harbaugh might end up winning Coach of the Year.
Yeah, he should. I mean, I definitely a candidate for sure. I mean, the Chargers for the last couple of years, biggest thing was their coaching. It wasn't Justin Herbert. It wasn't, kind of the talent around. I mean, their defensive front is one of the best defensive fronts in football. So, like, their roster, I think their construction as a team is good, but they've always had the coaching that basically, people want to say Justin Herbert this, Justin Herbert that. I say, well, give him some coaching, essentially, and see what happens. Because, I mean, you could say that for a lot of, quarterbacks here and there, but, like, you're seeing it right now. I mean, Justin Herbert with a really good head coach, and maybe we'll see in terms of what happens. I have them going to the playoffs. That's one of my kind of wild card teams as of right now when I look at it. But, like, if they get to the playoffs and, at least get through a round, right? I think that's at least something where the Chargers can kind of build themselves up for the future because they know for a fact they have the quarterback and they have the coach to build that quarterback, a really good quarterback, down the road.
Yeah. All right. So I do want to, yes. And so, yeah, I agree with all of that. But, just when I look at the Bengals schedule and, the fact that they only have 4 wins and they might have 4, maybe 5 left in them, if that, like, even the best they can do is 10-7, and they're probably not going to get that. So at the very best, the best case scenario for me seems like maybe 9 wins, and the Jets would maybe be able to compete. Like, I just can't get over how pissed off I am about how bad the Jets have been because this year the Jets they would have had a shot. They would have had a shot.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk about this Jake Paul Mike Tyson match, which I did not watch, and the reason I didn't watch it is because I had to go to bed because I had a flight and I had to get up at like 3 a.m. So I had to go to bed and I didn't watch it. But I'm sure you told me you watched it.
I did.
And I heard it was a total shit show. That's what I heard.
Yeah, it was like, so for those that don't know, me and Nick were both away. We're born in the same places, but I was down in Maryland, D.C. area to see a college friend who I haven't seen in a while. And Nick, of course, was in D.C. for what he was doing. But my buddy is like a very big, like, fighter, like in terms of like he loves like UFC and he loves boxing. So like, he's like, yeah, let's go watch the fights together. And I'm like, all right. So the Tyson fight and the Paul fight, I was excited to see. We went to Buffalo Wild Wings on Friday where it was taking place. Yeah, I mean, Tyson, obviously he's like 56 years old. Paul, obviously, I mean, yeah, the age gap between the two is just absolutely insane. So I'm not surprised the way it happened. I just felt like with Tyson, he just was not aggressive at all in the ring. I thought that he was very like defensive. Paul in the first like 2 or 3 rounds, I just thought that he was just kind of going at him, and Tyson really just did not have an answer. It's kind of expected. He's getting up there in age. He just doesn't have that same exact type of like, not power to him anymore. Obviously it's what it is, but that's kind of the overall headline was Paul beat him, and particularly, I mean, you could obviously make an argument of kind of how it went, but I didn't think it was close.
Yeah, well, that's what I heard happened. Like, I didn't watch any of it, but that's what I heard happen. I also heard there was a lot of streaming issues with Netflix. Like, it kept buffering.
Yeah, so for me, I mean, I watched it. I mean, Buffalo Wild Wings really didn't have much of that, but I know for a lot of like internet platforms and stuff, it was having some problems. So,
So, because I heard that like when people were watching, why wouldn't that be a thing on at Buffalo Wild Wings? Weren't they also using Netflix?
Yeah, but I mean, obviously, like on the TV, maybe compared to like some people were using on like their computers and stuff, that could have been it. I mean, because I never felt they had the problem there. I just didn't.
Right. Well, I mean, all that makes a certain amount of sense what you were saying before, which is that like, yeah, Mike Tyson is more than twice Jake Paul's age. So
Right.
obviously it makes sense that he's not going to win that fight. I mean, it's one of the few times we've ever seen anything like this, though, when it comes to like we never see basketball players, for instance, in their late 50s compete with like 27-year-olds. That never happens. Like you never see that in any other sport. Like you never see like I mean, I'm trying to think of a good example. Maybe like Brett Favre, who is
Mhm.
maybe not the best example because he has Parkinson's, so he's not healthy. But you get the point. It's like maybe I don't know, some quarterback who is around, who is, or you know, I don't know, whoever it might be. Maybe Patrick Ewing or something like that. He was like in his 60s now. You
Yeah.
never see him compete against 20 against NBA players in their 20s and 30s. Like that type of thing never happens. You would not have seen Brett Favre a couple of years ago compete with play quarterback in the NFL again against a bunch of young guys. Like you would never see that. And I think it's just sort of, I just thought it was sort of an interesting thing to see like a legend like Mike Tyson
Mhm.
at this age, because like we're not used to that. Like you're not going to see Michael Jordan try to compete with NBA players now. That's what it would be like. It would be like
Yeah.
watching Michael Jordan try to compete with, I don't know, Tyrese Halliburton or something like that.
Yeah, no, it was just interesting. I do think that, it obviously brought Netflix and, of course, the media and stuff at a really high rate. But yeah, I just think that, and I think they asked Tyson after the match of like, "Are you keep on going?" He said, "Yeah, I think he's going to." But like, he's obviously, and it's really only if like people are going to want to like do it against him. I think really
Yeah.
for Flex at this point in time. So, I think with Paul's on the other hand, he's just like, yeah, anybody could come at me. I'm ready for the overall challenge and stuff, and you know, I know a lot of people don't like Paul and deservedly for certain reasons, but I won't go into those. But we'll have to see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, fighting is a sport I don't really know. I never really watched Mike Tyson in his prime.
Me neither. Yeah.
Um, I was kind of too young, but what I do know is he punched Allen in The Hangover, and that's what I know him the best. That scene in The Hangover, that's what I know him. That's how I'm most familiar with Mike Tyson.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know if you saw the college games. Georgia beats Tennessee. Did you see Georgia beat Tennessee?
I saw it, but I didn't really see much of the game itself.
Okay. Well, I'll say. So I figured this would happen, and they beat them by 2 touchdowns. They beat them fairly convincingly. Georgia beat Tennessee fairly convincingly. And this sort of throws a whole monkey wrench into the whole, because I've been saying all along that the SEC is like the hardest conference to figure out
Mhm.
because there's no good arguments for anybody really. Like there's going to be likely four two loss teams, 10-2 SEC teams, one 11-1 SEC team who will probably be Texas. But if Texas A&M beats Texas, that's going to be there's going to be six. Sorry, there's going to be six 10-2 SEC teams, and here's how. I mean, there's going to be 5 teams that you can arguably that could be playoff teams, and one of them will have to be left out. Is what's going to happen. So here's how I'll put it. In the SEC so far, we have Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, and Ole Miss as 2-loss teams. Those 4 teams are 2-loss teams. And then you have Texas as a 1-loss team. And you can maybe argue now who the best team is of those 5 is hard to argue in
Right.
any direction because you have you get a team like Georgia who lost bad to Ole Miss, and they lost to Alabama, and they struggled against a lot of mediocre teams. So it's hard to say Georgia, right?
Mhm.
It's hard to say Alabama because they haven't really been great most of the year. They lost to Vanderbilt,
Yep.
and they lost to Tennessee. So it's hard to argue them. But you can't really argue Tennessee either because, well, they lost to Georgia fairly convincingly, and they lost to Arkansas. So and they struggled like Georgia against a lot of very average like SEC teams. And it's kind of hard to argue Ole Miss, even though they beat Georgia, because they also have a loss to LSU earlier in the year, and they lost to Kentucky. And it's hard to argue Texas because even though they're 11-1, their schedule has not been very strong. And when they finally got tested against Georgia in their own stadium, they got beat badly. So going through all those teams, there's no good argument for anybody. I'll say if Texas A&M beats Texas, and Texas does not go to the conference championship game, and that all depends on a bunch of tiebreakers and things like that. So I don't know how that's going to work. But assuming that if that does happen, Texas will be left out. Like that will be the odd. They will be the odd man out. Is how I would put it.
Yeah,
because their schedule, Texas's schedule, has been far weaker than all of the other SEC teams. But I do think Texas probably is better than A&M, and they will probably beat Texas A&M. But in that scenario, it's like, well, of those other teams, who gets left out? And there's no real good argument for it, for any of them.
Yeah. No, like you mentioned, I think there's it's kind of just an overall group of like solid teams, but there's not really that team that was like the head of the pack. I think that with Georgia, like we've talked about, Carson Beck, he's definitely been very ineffective for the last several weeks. It's been really the headline of their defense is really it, and their coaching. Obviously, Tennessee, they got some pieces over there. I don't really know the Tennessee team as much as I should be, but I think that their offense, I think, is more of their stronger suit. But I could be wrong. Their defense might be Tennessee, yeah.
No, not anymore.
It's more their defense.
Now it's their defense.
Okay.
They actually have a really good defense, especially they have a really good defensive line, actually. It was throughout pretty much almost all my life, or at least as long as I've been following sports, Tennessee's offense has been great and their defense has been terrible until this year. Now their offense isn't clicking and their defense is actually really good.
Okay. Well, that basically tells me how much I know about them. So, but it's either way, one of the ways around. But like we kind of can see, right, is most of these college teams, right, are very unbalanced, but they're pretty solid teams. So now it just comes down to a lot of the strength of schedules, the tiebreakers, and with the championship games coming up, typically usually the first week of December. Now there's really the crunch time for these last 2 weeks of the college football season, where we're really going to start getting into the rankings and really get the chance to kind of see the first playoff format of kind of this new regime of college football.
Yeah, well, I mean, in fairness, Carson Beck has been pretty bad, but he actually played pretty well against Tennessee. In that particular game, he played pretty well. But how is that? How many games has he actually, like, that's the outlier. The thing with Carson Beck is that the good games are the outliers and the bad games are the norm.
Yeah.
That's how it's been this year. So, I mean, what do I think will happen? Well, what I think will happen is Texas gets in, Ole Miss gets in, Georgia gets in, and Alabama gets in, and Tennessee is the odd man out. That's what I think will happen based on the resumes that they have. I think that, I mean, look, Georgia beat Tennessee, Alabama beat Georgia, and Tennessee beat Alabama. So they all beat each other. So it's hard to use head-to-head as any sort of real argument for any of those teams. But I think that Tennessee's resume has been the worst of all of them. First of all, they got beat convincingly by Georgia. Alabama, like, they were a convincingly better team. Alabama did not get beat convincingly by Tennessee, and Georgia did not get beat convincingly by Alabama. In fact, all that happened with Georgia and Alabama is Georgia ran out of time, and they easily could have won that game if they didn't just lay an egg in the first half. Whereas Tennessee was a convincingly worse team than Georgia when they played. The other thing is that Tennessee has struggled against a lot of mediocre teams, a lot worse than, say, Alabama has throughout the year. So I think Tennessee probably gets left out, is how I would put it, in that scenario where they can only pick 4 SEC teams. BYU, I don't know if you saw BYU lost to Kansas. This was another trap game that I had. I can't believe I took BYU. I can't believe I took BYU minus 2.5. This was a trap. A classic trap. They were only favored by 2.5 against Kansas. Kansas is supposed to stink. But BYU, who is probably the favorite, who are probably the favorites to win the Big 12 right now. From the way that BYU has been playing, I'm not sure they can beat Colorado. I mean, they can, but I'm not sure they will beat Colorado from the way they've been playing. And I can't believe I bet BYU. I should have. I mean, Vegas was basically telling you that these teams are even, given that BYU was a 2.5-point favorite at home. BYU right now, they're a 1-loss team. They could easily be a 3-loss team. They were fortunate. They needed to come back to beat Oklahoma State, who are not a good. Who was not a good team. And if not for that very flimsy, very fugazi holding call against Utah, BYU would have lost that game too. They could easily be a 3-loss team at this point.
Yeah. I didn't really see much of this, but I did hear about this. And, that's obviously why we play the game. Obviously Kansas isn't really been looked at as a football school, but, there's some teams out there, some ranked teams that you look at them and you're just like, they're not as good as what their record indicates. But maybe if you get a team on, an off day or something like this could happen. Upsets happen a lot more, I think, than people realize. And so it happened here.
Yeah, well, I think that the Big 12 is they're not a very deep conference, but they probably have the most parity. Basically, anybody can beat anybody,
right?
And Kansas is a 4-6 team. BYU is a 9-1 team, and they were undefeated going into the game. So basically, you have a team with a losing record versus a team that's undefeated, and Vegas, and they were basically even. They were basically even. Which is part of the reason, by the way, I can't stand automatic bids. I don't like the automatic bids for the playoffs because the conferences are just not even. They're very uneven. And look, I don't think BYU, even if they were to win the whole thing, I don't think they're worthy of a playoff spot. Like, they're not better than any of those 10-2 SEC teams.
A conference play, too, typically they don't usually favor their conference much. So
You're talking about the Big 12?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, because they're not that this year, at least they're not that good. Largely because Texas and Oklahoma, although Oklahoma stinks now, but they're two best teams both left. So that's part of the reason. And by the way, I was in Vegas watching this, and here's what happened. I was at the Mandalay Bay, and in the Mandalay Bay Sportsbook. And you know how in sports books they have that big screen where they have the sound on and everything?
Yes.
So they always have the biggest game, supposedly, on that big screen. So I'm watching it in the sports book. I'm watching the games in the sports book. After the Georgia-Tennessee game ends, you know what game they put on? They put on the UNLV game on the big screen. UNLV game. They were up by the game was basically over. It was like a total blowout, that game. And they put that game on the big screen, and they don't put the BYU Kansas game on the big screen. The BYU Kansas game has playoff implications, and it was close the entire game, and that's a huge upset, by the way, Kansas beating BYU, and they don't put it on the big screen. What are they doing? What are they doing?
Crazy. Yeah, for a big sports book type of place like that in one of the biggest betting cities in America, to have that happen like that is that's pretty.
How do you not put that game? Way more people care about the BYU Kansas game than the UNLV game. I don't remember who UNLV was playing. I think it may have been San Diego State. I could be wrong about that. UNL. So you put, and the whole game was a blowout. Hold on a second. UNLV played. San Diego State. I was right. UNLV was playing San Diego State. The game was a blowout. The entire game was a blowout. They ended up winning 41-20. And the whole time they had that game on the big screen and not the BYU Kansas game. Mind blowing to me. And I even asked them if they could change it, and they said no, they wouldn't change it. And I was now people are going to say, "Well, you were in Vegas." I get that, but it's not just people from Vegas and Vegas sports books. It's people from all around the country that are in Vegas sports books. And BYU Kansas was a much bigger game than UNLV San Diego State, especially given that game was a blowout. It's not even like it was close.
Yeah, no,
it's close, and it has playoff implications.
Right, yeah, make it make sense. So, I understand, of course, UNLV, it's kind of the Vegas, metro area type of team, but, the game's out of reach, and you can
Yeah.
put it to a game that has playoff implications. I mean, come on, like it's like what are we
Also,
doing here?
is UNLV like any? But also, my question is UNLV any like really that relevant in the Vegas area, or are they kind of like Rutgers in the New York area? Whereas, like, yeah, Rutgers is not. People might follow Rutgers a little bit in the New York metropolitan area, but not much. I mean, they're not a story ever in New York. I mean, they're talked about less than I would say every other NFL team around the country is talked about more than Rutgers is. Like they're not talked about much at all. Like that's probably what I don't know for a fact, but I'm guessing that's what UNLV is in Vegas. I would guess.
Has to be.
So I do want to talk a little bit about my trip, my time in Vegas. So if you're wondering if I won or lost, I lost a little bit. I lost a little bit, although I lost on my. I made some really bad bets. I made some really bad ones. I bet the Falcons the +2.5 against Denver. That was not smart. And then at halftime, I bet the Falcons -4 second half, which not to cover -4 for the whole game, but just in the second half. They didn't score 4 points like the rest of that game. I should have known not to trust 4 p.m. Kirk Cousins. But I guess the time change, I got confused because it was a 1 o'clock game in Vegas time. So that was a really dumb move. I made some. There were some, and I thought that was an easy bet too.
Mm-hmm.
I also took the Saints against the Browns. That was a good bet, actually. That was one of the few that I won. And I had Georgia beating Tennessee. I had Georgia against Tennessee. I should have. 2 traps I fell into, like I said before, the BYU versus Kansas and LSU versus Florida. Those are 2 traps that I fell into. And I went to Caesars for a little bit, hung out in Caesars, and that was fine. A few guys tried to sell me cocaine. So I guess Vegas really is the way people say it is.
As they say, right? Whatever happens in Vegas stays there.
Yeah, or no, whatever happens in Vegas ends up on a podcast. That's how I would put it. But I played craps and I lost in craps. Although I did have, it's one of those things. Like craps is like, especially with $25 tables, which is kind of a lot. Most of the time it's 10 or 15. But sometimes on Saturday nights in Vegas, it's like it's going to be a $25 table, and that is like watching an erratic college football team. It's like they have their little sparks. But throughout the whole season, it's not sustainable. That's kind of what it could be when you play craps on at a $25 table. Like sure, you get a couple of good rolls, but if you play long enough, you end up giving it all back, and that's kind of what happened. That's kind of what happened with me. So I do want to end the show with another edition of Unnecessary Wagers. So hold on a second. Let me just pull it up. Hold on. All right. So here it is. It's a 10-leg parlay. So here it is. Pittsburgh -3.5 against the Browns. Chiefs -11 at the Panthers. Dolphins to score 4.5 against the Patriots, team total. Commanders -10.5 at home against Dallas. The Niners +2.5 at the Packers. Cardinals +1 at Seattle. The Ravens money line against the Chargers. The Bucks -5.5 at the Giants. The Broncos money line at the Raiders. And the Texans money line against the Titans. The Texans should cover the spread. I don't know how much I really trust Houston, but I just took the money line.
Okay, yeah. I mean,
we got to go over some of that.
Yeah, there's a lot to this. I do think that there's a lot of like big lines this week. I mean, the Chiefs Panthers line that doesn't surprise me at all. One of the best teams in football against one of the worst. The Patriots Dolphins one. Now, I feel like the Patriots, and I give credit to my Patriots a lot with the way that we've been playing. Win or lose the last now I would say 4 or 5 weeks. every game's been close. I know for the last couple of years in like our rebuild we're going through right now, we'll be getting blown out. But I will say that we're right there, and the 4.5 I think is a pretty fair line. I do think with the Dolphins, their defense I think is definitely you're able to move the ball I think against this Dolphins secondary.
Well, the spread is 7.
Oh, 7. I mean, 4.5.
It was 4.5 against the Rams, I think.
Okay, yeah, it was 4.5 against the Rams, but like, heck, it could be within 4.5 if it even happened to be that way. But I will say, I don't know. I do think that the Patriots can keep it within that overall span. We'll just have to see. But and then of course the Commanders Cowboys. The Cooper Rush is he's complete. He's a backup for a reason. He's just not good. So I'm not.
And by the way, I think the Commanders are a much better team than Houston is right now.
Yeah.
And Dallas couldn't keep it close against them. I mean, I will say, you're talking about the Patriots are right there. Most of those games that were close were not against good teams. Most of them. A few of them were. One or two of them were against good teams.
But like when you look around the league too, how many matchups now against when you're having a team, a lot of bad teams at this point in time of this year have been able to hang with some good teams. I mean, there's not like that one really good team that's going to be, completely over other teams. I agree with you. Don't get me wrong, but I do think with the way the Patriots have been playing, I mean, heck, they essentially should have gone blown out against the Rams on Sunday.
Yeah.
And because the way that our defense, for some odd reason, did not want to play man coverage of Christian Gonzalez on either Puka or Cooper Kupp, instead on Demarcus Robinson, Demarcus Covington, make sense. But our offense against a pretty good Rams front was able to kind of stay within reach. So it's like, I don't know. I feel like that, I know going to Miami, I think the odds are very slim for us, but like we could potentially cover that. I think that we'll have to see though. But
I think a lot of it depends on Miami.
Yeah, they're very inconsistent. But I do trust that Drake's gonna be able to move the ball. It's just a matter of how much can he.
Yeah. All I'm saying is most of the games that were close, that the Patriots were close in, were not against good teams. Most of them were against bad teams at best. I mean, the best team that they were close against was, I don't know if the Rams counts as close. I guess it kind of. But the Seahawks, that was that's an average team, I would say. Seattle's an average team, and that was the best. Which, by the way, is better than you can say about the Jets. In fairness to New England, in fairness, but most of those games that they're keeping close are against teams substantially worse than the Dolphins with Tua. Is how I would put it. I mean, I like the Cardinals a lot against Seattle. I think the Cardinals are a really hot team right now.
100%.
And the Steelers -3.5 against the Browns. Vegas seems to like the Browns a little. I mean, the Steelers are one of the best teams in the league.
They are. Yeah, they're definitely not a fluke anymore. I know we were kind of talking about how their play isn't as good as what the record shows, but no, now they're. Yeah, now I think the Steelers are definitely for sure to be taken for granted at this point. Obviously, with the way that they've been playing, but I mean, Jameis Winston, he's very up and down, and that's obviously who he is. He's a very, he's basically who he is. He's very up and down. I call Jameis Winston a roller coaster. I think that's exactly how you. I mean, you could say that for a lot of guys, but Jameis.
I mean, I would say that about Josh Allen.
Yes, but Josh Allen,
he's a great player, but he is a roller coaster.
He's a roller coaster, but at an elite level. So essentially, with Jameis Winston, it's like it's a roller coaster, but it's like, are you gonna get the really good Jameis Winston, who is gonna put up like he did in New Orleans the other day, or are you gonna have him like in a second start where he was bound to have a regression, but like it's gonna be just very to average.
Yeah, yeah. All right, that's our show today. I'm Nick DiMartino. That's Ben Kruse. You can follow me on Twitter at Nick DiMart. You can follow Ben at Ben Kruse at Ben Kruse 144. So, all right, we'll be back next week. Thanks for watching and listening, everybody.
Thanks, guys.